Entire civilizations have vanished from their homelands, only to reshape the world from afar. The story of diaspora is one of history's most powerful and overlooked forces. By the end of this journey, you will see the map of human history in an entirely new light. We will uncover how the mysterious Sea Peoples triggered a dark age and why a small group of exiles carried the seeds of modern science across continents. These are not just tales of loss, but of incredible renewal that forged the global connections we live with today. What does it truly mean for a people to be scattered, yet never broken? A grandmother teaches her granddaughter an ancient song in a language their new neighbors cannot understand. This quiet act of preservation, happening in countless homes across the world, captures the essence of a diaspora. It is far more than a journey from one place to another. The word itself comes from the Greek term for scattering, like seeds cast to the wind. Yet these are not just seeds of people, but of memory, identity, and a profound sense of loss that becomes woven into the fabric of a community for generations. Historian Robin Cohen helps us understand this by outlining the core features that transform a migrant group into a true diaspora. First, there is the dispersal itself, which can be forced by violence or chosen in hope. Then a collective memory and myth about the homeland takes root, a story passed down that becomes as important as the land itself. This fosters a strong, enduring group consciousness, a sense of us that persists across oceans and centuries. Finally, and often most painfully, is a feeling of alienation, a sense of not fully belonging in the host society. Consider the Armenian people. Their global diaspora was forged in the fires of genocide, a catastrophic event that shattered their ancestral presence. Yet that shared trauma did not erase their identity. Instead, it solidified it, creating a powerful global network bound by memory, faith, and a longing for a homeland that lives on in their hearts and culture. How does this enduring connection to a lost home shape a people's very soul? It fuels their art, their stories, and their deepest aspirations. With this deeper understanding of what a diaspora truly is, we can now turn to one of history's most enigmatic and powerful examples, a scattering that plunged the ancient world into darkness. A single scroll, carefully wrapped and guarded, journeys across deserts and oceans. This Torah is more than a text, it is a portable homeland. The story of the Jewish diaspora begins with a profound rupture, the Babylonian exile in 586 before the Common Era, when the sacred temple in Jerusalem was destroyed and the people were taken to a foreign land. This was not a one-time event, but the start of a long pattern of expulsions and migrations that would scatter Jewish communities across the globe. From the forced conversions and expulsion from Spain in 1492 to countless other displacements, each wave created new centers of life far from the ancient soil of Judea. In the midst of this upheaval, intellectual and cultural life not only persisted, it often flourished in extraordinary ways. Consider the philosopher and physician Maimonides, who wrote his masterpiece, The Guide for the Perplexed, while living in exile. His work synthesized faith and reason, becoming a cornerstone of Jewish thought and a profound contribution to the wider world. The diaspora itself became an engine of preservation and adaptation. In Babylon, far from Jerusalem, the Talmud was compiled, creating a detailed legal and ethical framework that could guide a people without a state. In new lands from Europe to the Middle East, religious practices evolved, incorporating local languages and customs while holding fast to a core identity. This remarkable balancing act led to profound contributions in every host nation, from the realms of finance and medicine to philosophy and the arts. Yet through it all, a steadfast hope for return to Zion remained a central, unbreakable tenet of faith. How is it possible for a people to maintain a cohesive identity for over 2,000 years without a sovereign state? The answer lies in a legacy of resilience written in sacred texts carried through time, a powerful precedent for cultural survival that we will see echoed, yet uniquely expressed, in the next civilization we examine. The deep grooves of a Khachkar cross stone hold more than artistic design. They are a map of memory carved by hands far from their homeland. For the Armenian people, the genocide of 1915 was a cataclysm that shattered their ancient presence in Anatolia, forcibly scattering survivors to the winds. This was not a migration, but a shattering, a catastrophic event that created a global diaspora almost overnight. In the face of such profound loss, the most urgent task became preservation. The unique Armenian alphabet, a source of immense cultural pride for over 1,600 years, became a shield against assimilation. The distinct rites of the Armenian Apostolic Church offered spiritual solace and a tangible link to a lost world. Across oceans, in new hubs from Beirut to Los Angeles to Moscow, communities fiercely rebuilt the pillars of their identity. They founded schools where children learned the ancient language their grandparents spoke, built churches that echoed with familiar hymns, and established political organizations with a single, unwavering mission: global recognition of the genocide. This was not merely about looking back, it was about securing a future. The diaspora's relentless advocacy and deep networks provided crucial support, both financial and intellectual, for the movement that would eventually lead to an independent Armenia in 1991. How does a people transform a story of profound victimhood into one of powerful global advocacy and vibrant cultural vitality? The Armenian answer lies in a collective memory so potent it fuels a nation in exile, a force we will see channeled in a completely different way by the next civilization, the master mariners of the ancient world. The rich purple hue of royal garments began with a humble sea snail, harvested by daring sailors along the Levantine coast. These were the Phoenicians, and their story of dispersal stands in stark contrast to the traumatic exiles we have explored. Their diaspora was not born of catastrophe but of commerce, a deliberate and brilliant expansion that wove a web of influence across the ancient Mediterranean. From their vibrant city-states of Tyre and Sidon, starting around 1500 years before the Common Era, Phoenician merchants set sail not as refugees but as pioneers of global trade. They established outposts and full colonies from Cyprus to Sicily, and most famously to the shores of North Africa, where the city of Carthage would rise to rival Rome itself. This was not about losing a homeland, but about projecting its power, creating a network so effective it functioned as a maritime empire without the need for a centralized state. What fueled this incredible reach? Their mastery of the sea was undeniable. They built strong, fast ships capable of long voyages, and they possessed a merchant's instinct for identifying desire. They traded not only in their famous purple dye, but in cedar wood, glass, and precious metals, connecting cultures that had never before interacted. Yet their most enduring export was one of pure practicality: their revolutionary alphabet. By developing a system of just 22 characters representing consonant sounds, they replaced the complex, unwieldy writing systems of the day with something accessible and efficient. This script was so effective that the Greeks eagerly adapted it, adding vowels, and in doing so, created the direct ancestor of the very letters you are hearing now. The Phoenician diaspora demonstrates a profound truth: a civilization can embed itself into the world not through conquest and domination, but through connection and exchange. Their network was their strength, a series of independent ports bound by shared commercial interests, a common language, and a culture of seafaring. How does a people exert such widespread influence without a massive army or a single emperor? The answer lies in the power of a good idea, whether it is a better way to write or a coveted color carried on the currents of trade. This model of voluntary, commercially driven expansion sets the stage for a much more shadowy and disruptive group of seafarers whose arrival would not build networks but shatter them. The horizon did not bring trade but terror. Around 1200 years before the Common Era, the most advanced civilizations of the Eastern Mediterranean watched in disbelief as fleets of strange, unidentifiable ships descended upon their shores. These were the Sea Peoples, and their arrival was an apocalypse. We do not know precisely who they were, only what they left in their wake, a shattered world. This confederation of disparate groups, whose names like the Shurden and the Peliset echo faintly from ancient Egyptian inscriptions, was not a single civilization in exile, but a storm of them. Their massive, multi-ethnic migrations were a desperate, violent diaspora that did not just disrupt the Bronze Age world, they systematically dismantled it. The mighty Hittite Empire in Anatolia, a superpower of its day, collapsed completely. Its capital Hattusa burned and abandoned. Even the formidable New Kingdom of Egypt, under the pharaoh Ramesses III, was pushed to the brink, fighting for its very survival in epic naval battles depicted on temple walls. The inscriptions boast of victory, but the truth was far grimmer. Egypt was bled dry, its economy shattered, and its influence permanently broken. The intricate international trade routes that had connected empires for centuries were severed in an instant. Palaces that held vast archives of clay tablets were reduced to rubble, and literacy itself retreated into a dark age. What desperate circumstances could have launched such a terrifying, coordinated wave of humanity? Was it a chain reaction of crop failures and famine in their homelands? Were they themselves the displaced victims of other, earlier collapses, pushed from their lands only to become the pushers? Their identity remains one of history's greatest enigmas, but their legacy is one of absolute endings. This was a diaspora not of cultural preservation or commercial expansion, but of pure, world-shattering destruction. It created a power vacuum across the entire region, a blank slate upon which new peoples, like the Phoenicians we just met and the early Greeks, could eventually rise. The story of the Sea Peoples forces us to confront a difficult truth, that the scattering of peoples can be a creative force only after it has first been an utterly destructive one. This chaotic collapse, born from a desperate migration, sets the stage for a very different kind of imperial exile, one orchestrated by the most powerful and systematic empire the world had ever seen. The Grand Library of Alexandria stood not in Athens but on the Egyptian coast, a testament to a Greek world that had expanded far beyond its rocky homeland. This intellectual capital was the pinnacle of the Hellenistic age, a period born from the whirlwind conquests of Alexander the Great in the 4th century before the Common Era. His vast empire, stretching from mainland Greece to the borders of India, did more than redraw the political map. It launched a deliberate and unprecedented Greek diaspora. Soldiers who had marched with Alexander stayed to garrison new frontiers. Administrators arrived to govern vast territories. Merchants followed to supply the new outposts, and entire families sailed across the Mediterranean to settle in planned cities built in the Greek image. This was not a scattering of refugees, but a systematic seeding of an entire way of life. The result was a fusion of cultures, a common world where a Greek-speaking merchant in Babylon could conduct business using familiar legal forms, while local traditions and gods were often syncretized with the Greek pantheon. In bustling metropolises like Antioch in Syria and Seleucia on the Tigris, the agora, or public square, became the heart of civic life, surrounded by theatres for the plays of Euripides and gymnasiums where young men trained in the Greek fashion. This common cultural framework, this coin, or common Greek language, became the lingua franca of the Eastern Mediterranean for centuries, facilitating everything from high philosophy to simple trade contracts. It was this pre-packaged civilization that the Romans would later encounter, admire, and ultimately absorb, carrying its legacy forward into the bedrock of Western culture. How does a culture maintain its core identity while simultaneously adapting to and influencing a dozen others? The Greek model reveals diaspora as a powerful tool of soft power and cultural hegemony, where language, art, and urban design could integrate an empire more effectively than legions alone. This top-down, imperial model of cultural spread stands in stark contrast to the experience of the next civilization, a people who were themselves profoundly shaped by the force of Roman expansion. The same spirals that adorn a sacred stone in Ireland appear on a warrior's helmet discovered in the heart of Anatolia. This is the legacy of the Celts, a civilization defined not by a single empire, but by a shared artistic vision and a gradual, sprawling diaspora across the European continent. Beginning around the 5th century before the Common Era, tribes known as the Gauls, the Galatians, and the Britons moved out from their Central European homelands. They were renowned as fearsome warriors who once stormed the gates of Rome itself and raided the sacred Greek sanctuary at Delphi, yet their true sophistication lay in their hands and minds. They were master metalworkers whose intricate jewelry and weaponry were sought after for centuries. They were skilled farmers who organized their society around a learned class of druids, keepers of a vast and complex oral tradition that held their laws, history, and spiritual beliefs. This vibrant world, however, faced immense pressure from expanding empires. The Roman conquest of Gaul, famously chronicled by Julius Caesar, was a systematic campaign of subjugation. Later, the arrival of the Angles, Saxons, and Jutes into Britain pushed the native Celtic Britons westward and southward, off their own land. This series of invasions and conquests did not erase Celtic culture. Instead, it compressed it, forcing it to the very edges of the map, to the rocky coasts of Ireland, the highlands of Scotland, the mountains of Wales, and across the sea to the peninsula of Brittany. In these peripheral refuges, something remarkable happened. The Celtic languages and artistic traditions, no longer under the heel of a dominant foreign power, were preserved in isolation. For centuries, these communities nurtured their unique identities, their bardic poetry, and their complex knotwork, creating cultural reservoirs that would experience powerful revivals much later in history. The Celtic experience forces us to ask a profound question. What happens to a civilization when its geographical center is erased, and its heart continues to beat only on the distant margins? Their story is one of fragmentation and tenacious endurance, proving that a culture can survive not through centralized power, but through the resilience of its art, its language, and its memory, safeguarded in the lands others overlook. This pattern of survival through displacement, however, would soon be followed by a diaspora propelled not by invasion, but by an unshakable and fervent faith. A sacred flame carried across the waves in a bronze vessel could not be allowed to go out. For the Zoroastrians fleeing the Islamic conquest of Persia in the 8th to 10th centuries, this fire was the heart of their ancient faith, a symbol of their covenant with Ahura Mazda, the one wise Lord. Their desperate voyage eastward culminated on the shores of Gujarat in India, where they presented themselves to a local Hindu king. The story goes that the ruler, seeking to test their intentions, sent them a vessel filled to the brim with milk, a silent message that his kingdom was full. In a brilliant act of cultural diplomacy, the Zoroastrian priest stirred a spoonful of sugar into the milk, sweetening it without causing it to overflow. The metaphor was perfect. They promised to integrate and enrich the local society without disrupting it. The king granted them refuge, but with specific conditions. They must adopt the local Gujarati language and dress, and they must not seek converts. This social contract became the foundation for one of history's most successful and enduring diasporas, the Parsis. In their new home, they meticulously preserved the core tenets of their faith. They continued to recite from the sacred Avesta, to venerate the four elements of fire, water, earth, and air, and to practice their unique funeral rites in structures known as towers of silence, where the bodies of the deceased were exposed to the elements. Their commitment to peaceful integration, however, did not mean assimilation. They became masters of cultural negotiation, thriving as merchants and artisans, and later, under the British Raj, they rose to become legendary industrialists, establishing global corporations, and famed philanthropists who built hospitals, schools, and universities in Bombay. How does a community, forbidden from seeking new members, maintain its religious and ethnic identity for over 1,000 years? The Parsi answer lies in an unbreakable internal cohesion, a profound dedication to education and charity within their own community, and a genius for adapting their economic and social roles to benefit their new homeland. Their story is a quiet testament to the power of adding sugar to the milk, of enriching a society while fiercely guarding a sacred flame. This model of flourishing through peaceful integration sets the stage for a diaspora of a vastly different scale, one that would see millions leave the Indian subcontinent, not as refugees but as laborers for a global empire. A Romani violin carries a melody that is a map of a 1,000-year journey. The Romani people began their exodus from northern India around 1,000 years ago, their departure likely triggered by the violent upheaval of military invasions. They moved not as a single mass but in family and tribal groups, a slow migration westward through the Persian Empire, into the Byzantine heartlands, and finally, into the unfamiliar lands of Europe. They arrived not as conquerors but as perpetual outsiders, a status that would define their existence for centuries. Their very name became a label as Europeans, hearing their origins, mistakenly called them Egyptians, which was later shortened to Gypsies, a term many now consider a painful relic of this misunderstanding. Their survival depended on filling economic niches that others overlooked or disdained. They became the indispensable traveling tinsmiths, the horse traders who moved between villages, the entertainers whose music and dance brought fleeting joy to feudal societies. Yet these very roles which made them useful also made them vulnerable, living on the margins, maintaining their own distinct customs and language. They were easily cast as mysterious, untrustworthy, and foreign. This prejudice was codified into law and brutal practice. In Wallachia and Moldavia, they were enslaved for over 500 years, treated as property to be bought and sold. Across Europe, they faced expulsion, forced assimilation, and violence. This long history of persecution reached its horrific climax in the Nazi genocide, the porajmos, or the devouring, where hundreds of thousands of Romani people were systematically murdered in concentration camps, a tragedy often overlooked in the broader narrative of the Holocaust. So what does it mean to be a stateless nation, with a homeland remembered only in the roots of your language and the cadence of your songs? The Romani language itself, with its clear links to Sanskrit, is a living archive of their Indian origins, a homeland not sought as a political destination, but cherished as a cultural and ancestral memory. Their identity is not bound to a flag or a border. but to a shared history of movement, a complex web of family and tribal loyalties, and an oral tradition that has carried their laws and their stories across continents. The Romani experience forces us to expand our idea of a nation, proving it can exist not on a map, but in the steadfast bonds of community and a collective memory of the road itself. This profound connection to a non-territorial identity finds a powerful parallel in another scattered people, whose exile was driven not by military campaigns, but by a promise of divine favor and the brutal realities of the transatlantic slave trade. The clank of iron and the salt of tears mingled in the air of the holding forts along the West African coast. This was the brutal prelude to the largest forced displacement in human history, the transatlantic slave trade. From the 16th to the 19th centuries, this was not a diaspora of choice or even of conquest, but a system of industrialized human theft that ripped millions of people from West and Central Africa, shattering families, languages, and kingdoms. The journey across the Atlantic, the Middle Passage, was a calculated nightmare of suffocating confinement and dehumanization designed to break the spirit before arrival in the Americas. Yet the human spirit proved unbreakable. In the face of this systematic attempt to erase their past, enslaved Africans and their descendants performed a miracle of cultural creation. They could not bring their physical homelands, so they rebuilt them in song, in story, and in spirit. They took the fragments of the diverse cultures from which they were stolen, Yoruba, Akan, Congo, and countless others, and blended them with the European languages and customs imposed upon them and the indigenous knowledge of the lands they were forced to work. This powerful synthesis gave birth to entirely new worlds. In Brazil, the spiritual traditions of the Yoruba people evolved into candomblé, a religion that preserved African deities behind the facade of Catholic saints. In the Caribbean, Haitian Vodou became not just a faith but a source of revolutionary strength, fueling the only successful slave revolt that established a nation. And from the depths of sorrow and field hollers, new musical languages emerged, the complex rhythms that would become samba, the soulful cries that would become the blues, and the improvisational genius that would become jazz. This cultural reclamation was always accompanied by a relentless fight for freedom. From the maroon communities of escaped slaves who built independent societies in the jungles of Suriname and the mountains of Jamaica, to the massive uprising in Saint-Domingue, to the tireless activism of the civil rights movement, the quest for liberation is the diaspora's central, unending story. How can a people create a new identity from the fragments of a stolen past? The African diaspora answers with a legacy of profound suffering transformed into unparalleled creativity, a testament to the resilience required to build a future from ashes. This powerful narrative of survival and reclamation against overwhelming odds finds a different expression in the story of another group forced from their homes, not across an ocean but across a continent. The quiet dikes they had built to hold back the sea could not hold back the tide of empire. In the fertile marshlands of Acadia, modern-day Nova Scotia, French-speaking farmers had lived for generations, cultivating a distinct identity separate from both New France and the New England colonies. Their neutrality was their shield until it became their target. In the mid-1750s, during the global conflict known as the 7 Years' War, the British authorities, distrusting this French Catholic population on their doorstep, made a brutal decision. This was Le Grand Dérangement, the Great Expulsion, a calculated act of ethnic cleansing. Soldiers rounded up families, burning their villages and farms, and forced them onto overcrowded ships. Thousands of Acadians were scattered like leaves in a hurricane, cast adrift to ports across the Atlantic world, from the American colonies to England, France, and the Caribbean. Many perished from disease or starvation during the voyage, their world shattered in an instant. Yet the story does not end in that moment of devastation. Through decades of hardship and relentless searching, a remarkable number of these exiles found their way to a new promised land, the humid, swampy bayous of French-controlled Louisiana. Here, in this isolated and challenging environment, they began the slow, painstaking work of reassembling their culture from memory. They rebuilt their farms and fishing communities, but their world was no longer purely Acadian. In this cultural crossroads, their traditions began a fascinating dance with those of their new neighbors. They adopted words and culinary techniques from the Spanish colonists, learned new farming methods from the German settlers along the Mississippi, and incorporated ingredients like filet powder from the Native American Choctaw people. Their mournful ballads, echoing the loss of their homeland, blended with the rhythmic influences of the African and Caribbean communities already present, slowly evolving into the lively, accordion-driven sound of Cajun music. Their language, too, transformed in isolation, preserving archaic forms of 18th-century French while eagerly absorbing loanwords, creating the unique Cajun dialect spoken today. Even their name was reshaped by their new home, from Acadian to Cajun. How does a community rebuild its world after being violently uprooted? The answer is written in the gumbo simmering in a Louisiana pot, a dish that is itself a metaphor for this entire process, a rich blend of many ingredients creating something entirely new and uniquely flavorful. The Cajun culture is not a perfect replica of a lost Acadian past, but a vibrant, living creation forged in the crucible of exile, a powerful testament to the human capacity for resilience through fusion. This pattern of creating a new identity from the fragments of an old one, while anchored in a specific place, finds a startling parallel in a diaspora defined by its very lack of a territorial home. A master silk weaver smuggles his designs out of France, his skill itself a form of contraband. The year is 1685, and King Louis XIV has just revoked the Edict of Nantes, a decree that had once granted limited rights to French Protestants. With a stroke of a pen, their faith becomes illegal. Churches are destroyed, and worshippers face forced conversion or violence. This is not a slow migration, but a panicked exodus of hundreds of thousands of Huguenots, France's most skilled and industrious artisans, merchants, and financiers. They are watchmakers from Geneva, glassblowers from Normandy, and silk weavers from Lyon, and they carry their irreplaceable knowledge in their minds and hands. In their flight, they find sanctuary in rival Protestant nations, which eagerly welcome this sudden windfall of human capital. In the Spitalfields district of London, these refugee weavers transform the British silk industry, introducing intricate patterns and techniques that allow England to compete directly with the silks of France. Across the North Sea, Huguenot merchants in Amsterdam inject new vitality into the Dutch financial world, while in Prussia, they are integrated directly into the state's military and administrative structures, strengthening the very powers aligned against Louis XIV. This mass departure created a devastating brain drain for France, crippling entire sectors of its economy for a generation. How does the expulsion of a religious minority inadvertently forge the strength of rival nations? The Huguenot Exodus is a powerful lesson in the unintended consequences of intolerance, demonstrating that a diaspora can act as a rapid and brutal transfer of innovation, enriching the very enemies a king sought to weaken. This deliberate scattering of intellectual capital sets the stage for an even more profound dispersal of knowledge, one that would preserve the very light of classical learning while Europe descended into darkness. The quiet halls of the University of Constantinople were no longer safe. As the Ottoman armies closed in, the empire's most brilliant minds faced a desperate choice. Greek scholars, fearing the final collapse of their world, gathered what they could carry: Their trunks were not filled with gold or jewels, but with something far more precious, fragile manuscripts containing the complete works of Plato and Aristotle, along with other classical texts that Western Europe had not seen for 1,000 years. The fall of Constantinople in 1453 was not just a military conquest, it was a seismic event that shattered the last direct link to the ancient Greek world. But in that shattering, seeds were scattered. These refugee scholars sailed to Italy, where they were welcomed by wealthy patrons in city-states like Florence and Venice, who were hungry for this lost knowledge. They began teaching the Greek language and philosophy directly, unlocking a vast intellectual treasury. The West was suddenly reacquainted with the full scope of classical thought, not through dusty, second-hand translations, but from the original sources. This direct encounter with antiquity ignited an explosion of creativity, fueling the humanist movement and providing the intellectual foundation for the Italian Renaissance. It was a brain drain of catastrophic proportions for the collapsing Byzantine Empire, but a windfall of incalculable value for the rising West. This pattern of intellectual flight is a constant in history. Centuries later, the rise of the Nazi regime triggered a similar exodus. Jewish scientists like Albert Einstein and countless other doctors, artists, and philosophers were forced to flee Germany and Austria. Their arrival in the United States and Britain did not just save lives, it transferred an entire ecosystem of knowledge, supercharging allied scientific research and directly contributing to the very foundations of modern physics and the post-war technological boom. The cost to the homeland is a hollowing out, a loss of the very minds that drive progress and cultural vitality. The gain to the host nation is a sudden, profound infusion of talent and perspective that can alter the course of its history. What is the true value of a scholar with a single suitcase of books? The intellectual diaspora proves that the most powerful and enduring cargo a person can carry is not wealth but wisdom. This flow of knowledge, however, stands in stark contrast to the next story, a diaspora defined not by the flight of ideas, but by the painful, physical exile of an entire people from their ancestral soil. The high, thin air of Dharamshala holds a nation in exile. In 1959, the Dalai Lama, Tibet's spiritual and political leader, was forced to flee his home, crossing the Himalayas on foot after a failed uprising against Chinese rule. He was not traveling alone, he carried the hopes of a people with him. This marked the beginning of a modern diaspora defined by a profound spiritual struggle, an ongoing effort to preserve a unique Buddhist civilization from far beyond its borders. The heart of this effort beats in the small Indian hill station of Dharamshala, where the central Tibetan administration operates as a fully functional government in exile. This is not a symbolic gesture. It runs a network of schools where children learn their complex native language and history. It oversees cultural programs to train a new generation in traditional Thangka painting, monastic dance, and philosophical debate. It wages a relentless global diplomatic campaign, advocating for the cause of Tibet on the world stage. The question is not just about political autonomy, but about the survival of a worldview. Can a civilization's soul endure when its physical body, the homeland itself, is occupied and transformed? Tibetan communities scattered from Switzerland to the United States answer this challenge daily. In monasteries built in foreign landscapes, the deep, resonant chants of ancient sutras continue. Artists meticulously recreate mandalas, those intricate symbolic maps of the cosmos, on canvases far from the mountains that inspired them. The Tibetan language, with its own unique script, is taught not as a relic but as a living vessel for a people's identity and spiritual teachings. This is a diaspora fighting for its cultural life, a contemporary echo of the historical struggles for preservation we have witnessed before, yet unfolding in real time before our eyes. It forces us to confront the modern mechanisms of cultural endurance, where a government without a territory and a people separated from their land prove that a nation can exist as a powerful, persistent idea. The jangling of keys is a sound passed down through generations, a metallic whisper of a world left behind in haste. These are not forgotten relics, but potent symbols of homes and orchards lost during the War of 1948, an event seared into Palestinian memory as the Nakba, the catastrophe. In that moment, entire villages were emptied and hundreds of thousands of people were displaced, creating a refugee crisis that would define a nation in exile. Subsequent wars in 1967 and beyond only deepened this reality, swelling the number of Palestinians living far from their ancestral land. For many, the journey ended not in new cities, but in sprawling refugee camps in Jordan, Lebanon, and Syria. These camps, intended as temporary shelters, hardened into permanent neighborhoods of concrete and corrugated metal, places where political limbo became a way of life. Generations have been born into a unique statelessness, often denied full citizenship in their host countries and living under the strain of poverty and restricted rights. Yet within these challenging conditions, a powerful counterforce emerged, a collective memory so meticulously preserved it defied the chaos of displacement. Elderly refugees meticulously drew maps of their lost villages from memory, recording the names of every spring, every grove of olive trees. They passed down deeds to properties they could no longer visit and told stories of the fig trees that once grew in their family courtyards. This act of remembrance was not mere nostalgia. It was the foundation of a national identity that solidified and intensified precisely because it was forged in exile. How does a people maintain a connection to a homeland most have never seen? The answer lies in this daily, deliberate act of cultural preservation, where the past became a political act. The diaspora itself became the primary bearer of the national cause, with political movements finding vital support and intellectual energy from communities in Europe and the Americas. At the very heart of this struggle lies the deeply contentious and unresolved issue of the right of return, the demand that refugees and their descendants be allowed to go back to the homes they lost. This is not just a political or legal claim, but a deeply personal one, a thread of hope that connects the jangling keys of the past to the aspirations of the future. The Palestinian experience demonstrates with profound intensity how a diaspora can become the living heart of a nation, sustaining its cause across decades and borders. This dynamic of a people defined by a recent traumatic displacement finds a complex and parallel echo in the story of another group uprooted by the very same conflict. A Holocaust survivor's foot touches the sand, a physical answer to a prayer whispered for 2,000 years. For centuries, the Passover Seder concluded with the words, "Next year in Jerusalem," a poignant hope for a return to Zion held by a people living everywhere and nowhere. The late 19th century saw this ancient longing crystallize into a modern political movement, Zionism. Its goal was revolutionary: to end the Jewish diaspora by actively facilitating a mass return to the ancestral homeland and the establishment of a sovereign Jewish state. This vision ignited a powerful engine of migration known as Aliyah, or ascent. Wave after wave of pioneers arrived from Europe, and later, entire ancient Jewish communities from across North Africa and the Middle East made the journey, often under duress, their own exiles within the exile coming to an abrupt end. The culmination was the declaration of the State of Israel in 1948. In a single moment, the paradigm that had defined Jewish existence for millennia was shattered. The diaspora now had a political center, a homeland with an army, a flag, and a government. What happens when a 2,000-year-old dream is suddenly made real? The establishment of Israel stands as history's most dramatic reversal of a diaspora, a unique case where a scattered people actively gathered themselves into a nation-state. This new reality instantly created a complex and sometimes fraught relationship between the diaspora and the homeland. Jews around the world now had a state to advocate for and take pride in, while the state itself grappled with the immense challenge of absorbing countless cultures into a single national identity. This transformation from a people defined by exile to a people defined by sovereignty continues to shape every aspect of global Jewish life and international politics, a living testament to the power of a dream realized and the profound complexities that follow. The open sea offers no shelter from the sun or from pirates. For over 1 million Vietnamese after the war's end in 1975, this was the terrifying price of freedom. The fall of Saigon did not bring peace for everyone, but instead ushered in an era of political repression and devastating economic hardship, particularly for those associated with the former South. Their only escape route was the most dangerous one imaginable, a desperate voyage into the unknown aboard overcrowded, unseaworthy boats. These were the Vietnamese boat people, and their journey was a lottery with the highest stakes. Storms could capsize their fragile vessels in an instant. Thai pirates stalked the shipping lanes, preying on the helpless, committing robbery and violence with impunity. Thirst, hunger, and disease were constant companions on a crossing that could take weeks. It is estimated that tens of thousands, perhaps even 200,000 people, perished at sea, their stories lost to the waves. For the survivors who reached the shores of neighboring countries like Malaysia or Indonesia, the ordeal was far from over. They were met not with open arms, but with sprawling, overcrowded refugee camps, where they often faced years of limbo, waiting for a nation to offer them a permanent home. This was not a simple migration, it was a harrowing filtration of human spirit, where only the most resilient or the most fortunate made it through. How does a person carry the memory of such a traumatic passage for the rest of their life? The answer is etched into the very fabric of the communities they would eventually build. The first generation carried this trauma in silence, a deep undercurrent of loss beneath the determined work of starting over. When countries like the United States, Canada, and Australia finally opened their doors, the refugees arrived with nothing but their will and their memories. They took the most difficult, low-wage jobs, working in factories, cleaning offices, and farming unfamiliar land, all to give their children a foothold in a new world. They pooled their resources, a practice born of necessity in the camps, and transformed dilapidated urban neighborhoods into vibrant commercial hubs. In places like Little Saigon in California, you can walk down a street and hear the cadence of the Vietnamese language, smell the aroma of pho simmering for hours, and see the vibrant red and gold decorations of the Tiletawani New Year festival. This was not about living in the past, but about using culture as an anchor in a new and bewildering society. The children of these refugees, bearing the weight of their parents' sacrifice, pursued education with a ferocious intensity, excelling in academia, medicine, engineering, and the arts. Within a single generation, a community that had arrived with only the clothes on its back had established itself as a model of successful integration and profound contribution. The story of the Vietnamese diaspora asks us a difficult but beautiful question. How can the deepest loss become the foundation for the most resilient hope? Their journey from leaking boats to thriving neighborhoods stands as a modern testament to the human capacity, not just to survive, but to rebuild a world from nothing. The rhythmic pulse of a salsa song in Little Havana is more than just music. It is the defiant heartbeat of a homeland preserved in exile. This cultural world was built by one of the most politically potent diasporas of the modern era. The Cuban Exodus began in earnest after the 1959 revolution, starting with a wave of upper and middle-class professionals who lost everything and saw their nation transformed into a communist state. They arrived in Florida with little more than their education and a burning determination to reclaim their country. Their arrival began the profound transformation of Miami from a sleepy retirement town into a dynamic, bilingual global city. These early exiles built businesses, banks, and media empires, creating an economic powerhouse that replicated the Cuba they had lost. Later waves of migration, like the dramatic Mariel boatlift of 1980, brought a new cross-section of Cuban society, including many working-class citizens, further diversifying the community but also reinforcing its unifying characteristic, a deep-seated opposition to the Castro regime. This political identity became the diaspora's driving force. Exile organizations wielded immense influence, lobbying successfully for the stringent U.S. economic embargo against Cuba and ensuring that hostility toward the communist government remained a cornerstone of American foreign policy for decades. Their political clout in the swing state of Florida made them a force that presidents and lawmakers could not ignore. Yet, alongside this fierce political project ran a profound cultural one. In the cafes along Cal Ocho, old men still play dominoes and argue about baseball as if they were in a Havana park. The scent of strong cafecito and slow roasting lechon asado fills the air, preserving a culinary landscape frozen in a pre-revolutionary time. Writers like Reinaldo Arenas wrote searing literature of displacement, ensuring the story was told not just in political rallies, but in the intimate language of art. How does a diaspora's political identity evolve when the original conflict stretches across generations? For the Cuban community, the answer is complex. The older exiles who remember the lost Cuba firsthand maintained an unwavering stance, their identity inextricably linked to the dream of return and regime change. But their children and grandchildren, born and raised in the United States, often navigate a more nuanced path. They inherit the pain of their parents' exile and remain deeply connected to the culture, yet their lived reality is American. Their focus sometimes shifts from reclaiming a past they never knew to shaping a future that acknowledges the complexities of the island today, all while the vibrant, parallel Cuba their grandparents built in Miami continues to thrive around them. This enduring cultural and political reality, sustained for over 6 decades, demonstrates a diaspora's power to create a lasting counterpoint to the homeland itself. A university lecture in Los Angeles is delivered in the melodic tones of Farsi, a language of ancient poetry now used to debate modern political theory. The 1979 Iranian Revolution did not just change a government, it scattered a nation's intellect to the winds. In the years that followed, a massive exodus began. Those associated with the ousted monarchy fled for their lives. Leftists who had opposed the Shah but found themselves targeted by the new theocracy sought escape. Religious minorities like Baha'is and Jews, along with secular intellectuals and artists, faced persecution and saw no future for themselves. This was not a single wave, but a sustained brain drain of profound proportions, a hemorrhage of doctors, engineers, scientists, and academics that forever altered Iran's societal fabric. In their new homes from Toronto to Berlin, this diverse and highly educated community did not simply assimilate and disappear. They became a global network of influence, a parallel Iran operating on the world stage. Iranian names became prominent in Silicon Valley's tech empires, on the faculties of major universities, and in the operating rooms of prestigious hospitals. Their individual successes were remarkable, but their collective impact was even greater, forging a reputation for intellectual excellence that became a defining feature of the diaspora itself. Yet this external success was always shadowed by a deep, complex connection to the homeland. In living rooms across the world, families meticulously set the Haft-Sin table for Nowruz, the Persian New Year, with its 7 symbolic items starting with the letter S. They recited the verses of Hafez, finding in his centuries-old words a comfort and a connection that transcended politics. This vibrant cultural preservation, however, exists alongside a fierce and often contentious internal dialogue. The diaspora became a living archive of Iran's contested history, a place where monarchists, leftists, and secular Democrats, united by their opposition to the current regime, continue to debate the causes of the revolution and the future of their country. Through satellite television, social media, and academic journals published in English and Farsi, this global community engages in a critical conversation that is largely impossible inside Iran itself. So, can a scattered people become the guardians of a nation's suppressed intellectual traditions? The Iranian diaspora answers yes, acting as a vital repository for liberal thought and cultural critique, ensuring that certain conversations about freedom, identity, and the past are not erased but amplified from every corner of the globe. The bustling streets of a Chinatown are more than a tourist attraction. They are the vibrant nerve centers of the world's largest and most economically powerful diaspora. This global network, tens of millions strong, was not built in a single generation. Its foundations were laid by Silk Road traders who ventured beyond the Middle Kingdom, followed by the mass exodus of impoverished laborers, known as coolies, who mined tin in Malaysia and built railroads in the American West during the colonial era. Today, this flow continues with students and professionals seeking global education and opportunity, creating a continuous chain of migration linking centuries. Their collective success is staggering, driven by a unique engine known as the Bamboo Network, an intricate web of family-run businesses and trusted clan associations that facilitate trade and investment across continents. A manufacturer in Guangzhou can secure financing through a relative in Hong Kong, whose partner in Jakarta can distribute the goods throughout Southeast Asia, all bound by shared dialect and kinship ties that often supersede formal contracts. This creates a form of transnational capitalism built on profound cultural trust. Yet this immense economic integration does not come at the cost of cultural separation. In villages across Guangdong and Fujian, ornate ancestral halls and new schools stand as physical testaments to the steady flow of remittances sent home for generations. Clan associations in Bangkok or Vancouver meticulously organize celebrations for the Lunar New Year and the Hungry Ghost Festival, ensuring traditions are passed on to children born thousands of miles from their ancestral homeland. How does a community achieve such profound global influence while holding fast to a distinct identity? The Chinese diaspora embodies a powerful duality, mastering the art of being local citizens in their host countries while remaining steadfast cultural and economic partners to a homeland that stretches across the globe. This model of success through tightly knit networks sets the stage for a very different kind of modern dispersal, one propelled not by commerce, but by the collapse of an empire. The rich spice of a curry carries the story of an ocean crossing. While the Chinese diaspora built its power through commercial networks, the Indian dispersal was born from a far more coercive system, the vast machinery of indentured labor. Following the abolition of slavery in the British Empire, plantation owners from the Caribbean to Africa to the Pacific desperately needed a new source of cheap, controllable labor. Their solution was to recruit millions of impoverished Indians from rural villages, offering contracts that promised a return passage after 5 years of work, a promise often broken. This was the first great wave, an exodus of human hardship that shipped people to the sugar cane fields of Trinidad and Guyana, the shores of Fiji, and the coast of South Africa. Their journey was a brutal echo of the Middle Passage, crammed into sailing ships for a terrifying 3-month voyage around the Cape of Good Hope, a journey so deadly it was called the Kolapani, the Black Waters, believed in Hindu tradition to cause a loss of caste and spiritual purity. Upon arrival, they faced a life of back-breaking toil, living in segregated barracks reminiscent of the slave quarters that had just been emptied. Yet, within this system of oppression, they performed a miracle of cultural preservation. They could not bring the sacred rivers of India, so they built small temples near any stream or pond, consecrating the new land. They carefully guarded handwritten copies of the Ramayana, passing the epic tales of gods and heroes to children who had never seen the Ganges. They held onto their languages, Bhojpuri and Tamil, which slowly blended with English and local Creoles to form entirely new dialects. Over generations, this created unique hybrid cultures, the Indo-Caribbean and Indo-Fijian identities, where the hypnotic rhythm of tassa drums fused with calypso melodies, and where the Hindu festival of Diwali became a national holiday in Trinidad, celebrated with a Caribbean flair. How does a culture survive when it is transplanted not by choice, but by contract? The answer lies in the quiet stubbornness of daily ritual, the determination to find the divine in a foreign landscape. This foundational story of resilience through indenture sets the stage for a dramatic and contrasting second act. A new wave began in the mid-20th century, not of laborers but of the most highly educated. Doctors, engineers, and scientists, products of India's prestigious universities, began migrating to the United States, Canada, and Britain, seeking opportunity and fleeing bureaucratic constraints. This brain drain, initially seen as a loss for India, gradually transformed into a brain bank. These professionals did not just assimilate, they excelled, rising to lead major technology corporations, pioneering medical research, and shaping global finance. Their children, the second generation, often became senators, writers, and tech entrepreneurs, wielding influence at the highest levels of their adopted countries. The economic power of this global community, known as non-resident Indians, is now a colossal force. They send billions of dollars in remittances back to families in India, but their impact is far greater than money. They act as bridges for trade and investment, bringing international venture capital to Indian startups and transferring cutting-edge skills and knowledge back to the homeland. This creates a fascinating dynamic, a constant two-way flow between a rapidly modernizing India and its global extensions. So how does a diaspora maintain a connection to a homeland that is itself transforming at a dizzying pace? The Indian experience reveals a relationship that is no longer defined by a static memory of the past, but by an active, evolving partnership for the future. The connection is kept alive not through nostalgia alone, but through continuous engagement where the diaspora helps shape the very nation it once left behind. A thriving electronics shop in Lagos and a bustling textile factory in Sao Paulo share a common origin in the mountains of Lebanon. The story of the Lebanese diaspora is one of mercantile genius forged in the crucible of a fading empire. Beginning in the late 19th century, as the Ottoman Empire crumbled, economic stagnation and political unrest pushed enterprising individuals from the Levant to seek their fortunes abroad. They did not travel as conquerors or colonists, but as merchants carrying small stocks of goods, an intimate understanding of trade, and an unwavering trust in their own family networks. These networks became their greatest asset, a form of social capital that functioned as a global support system. A cousin in Marseille could secure a line of credit for a brother in Buenos Aires, who would then send goods to an uncle establishing a store in Dakar. This intricate web of trust, often centered around specific villages or religious communities back in Lebanon, allowed them to bypass formal banking systems and build commercial empires from the ground up. Their remarkable success often stemmed from an ability to identify and fill unmet needs in their new societies. In West Africa, they dominated the textile trade. In the Americas, they built retail and manufacturing empires. In Australia, they became pillars of the hospitality industry. What is the secret behind this global commercial footprint? It is a unique blend of risk tolerance, a deep-seated entrepreneurial spirit, and a cultural emphasis on familial obligation that transforms individual success into collective wealth. This success, however, has always been tethered to the homeland. For generations, remittances sent back to ancestral villages have been the lifeblood of the Lebanese economy, funding the construction of homes, schools, and infrastructure. These financial flows create a powerful, tangible link across oceans, a constant reinvestment in the idea of Lebanon, even by those who have built their lives elsewhere. The Lebanese diaspora demonstrates that a homeland can remain vitally present not through political power, but through an unbreakable economic and emotional umbilical cord, proving that a people scattered can weave themselves into the global economy while holding fast to the source of their identity. The mournful cry of a lone bagpipe carries across a hillside in distant Nova Scotia, a sound that seems to weep for the glens left behind. This music is the voice of the Scottish Diaspora, a global scattering born from both tragedy and ambition. The most poignant driver was the Highland clearances, a brutal period spanning the 18th and 19th centuries where aristocratic landlords systematically forced tenant farmers from ancestral lands their families had worked for generations. Crofters' stone cottages were burned to make way for the more profitable grazing of sheep, a deliberate act of social engineering that shattered an entire way of life. This heartbreak was compounded by a second wave of migration, as Scots from both the Highlands and the industrial lowlands sought new prospects in the burgeoning cities of the British Empire and the expanding United States during the Industrial Revolution. They did not arrive empty-handed. Scots became the backbone of imperial administration in Canada, the engineers who built railroads across India, and the merchants who shaped trade in the Caribbean. Their intellectual legacy is staggering, from the inventions of Alexander Graham Bell to the economic theories of Adam Smith. Yet, alongside these profound contributions, the diaspora performed a remarkable act of cultural preservation and reinvention. Far from the misty locks of home, they clung to potent symbols. Tartan, once a simple regional cloth, was transformed into a powerful emblem of clan identity, its patterns codified and celebrated in gatherings across the world. The poetry of Robert Burns, with its deep humanity and themes of love and loss, was recited at Burns suppers from Buenos Aires to Melbourne, becoming a timeless ritual of shared heritage. This global network of clan societies and Caledonian clubs created a romanticized, almost mythical version of Scotland, a brand of rugged Highlanders and noble warriors that was often more potent abroad than in the homeland itself. How does a diaspora romanticize and commercialize its cultural heritage across oceans? The Scottish experience reveals a profound truth that in exile, culture can be packaged, exported, and even commercialized, not as a betrayal of the past, but as a powerful tool for survival. The image of the kilted Highlander, sold on shortbread tins and whiskey bottles worldwide, is a testament to this phenomenon, a diaspora's curated portrait of home that ultimately reshaped how Scotland saw itself, fueling a tourism industry and a modern national pride rekindled from embers kept alive thousands of miles away. The damp, overcrowded hold of a coffin ship carried more than just the starving. It carried the seeds of a global nation. The Great Famine of the 1840s was a catastrophic rupture, a period of mass starvation and disease that emptied the Irish countryside and forced over 1 million people onto these death traps of vessels, so named for their horrifying mortality rates. This was not a simple migration, but a desperate flight from a man-made disaster, where British colonial policies exacerbated the potato blight, transforming a crop failure into a genocide in the eyes of many. Those who survived the harrowing Atlantic crossing arrived in cities like Boston and New York not as hopeful immigrants, but as destitute refugees, often met with signs that read, "No Irish need apply." They were crowded into the worst slums, relegated to the most dangerous and low-paying jobs, and caricatured as violent and inferior. Yet from this profound hardship, they forged a remarkable path to power. Barred from other professions, they turned to what was accessible: politics and policing. They mastered the machinery of the American urban political machine, organizing block by block to secure votes, jobs, and influence. Through sheer numbers and disciplined organizing, they eventually took control of city halls across the country, from New York to Chicago to Boston. Simultaneously, they became the backbone of the American labor movement, forming and leading powerful unions that fought for the rights of all workers. How does a persecuted minority transform itself into a political titan? The Irish answer was collective action, using the very structures of the city to claim a place within it. This external political ascent was matched by an intense internal cultural cohesion. The Catholic parish became the center of social life, a fortress of identity in a hostile land. The lively rhythms of traditional jigs and reels provided a joyful respite from daily struggles, while mournful ballads kept the memory of the lost homeland painfully alive. This connection was not merely sentimental, it was fiercely political. The diaspora became the financial and ideological engine for Irish nationalism. From the Fenian Brotherhood in the 19th century, which launched audacious raids into Canada to pressure Britain, to later widespread support for the Irish Republican Army in the 20th century, Irish America sent money, guns, and a powerful voice of advocacy across the ocean. The very term Irish America signifies this dual identity, a political and cultural force that operates within the United States while maintaining an active, often decisive, engagement with the affairs of the homeland. How does the memory of injustice and famine shape a diaspora's identity? For the Irish, that memory became a fuel for political mobilization, a story of collective victimhood that was channeled into building power abroad and relentlessly challenging the authority of the old oppressor. Their narrative is a masterclass in turning the bitter legacy of hardship into enduring political and cultural capital on a world stage, a testament to a people who refused to be erased. A sleek smartphone screen flashes with the synchronized dance moves of a global K-pop sensation, a cultural force amplified by voices trained in Los Angeles and producers raised in Toronto. This modern phenomenon rests upon a diaspora forged in the fires of conflict. The Japanese colonial period and the devastating Korean War did not just divide a peninsula, they scattered its people across the globe. Millions fled, creating enduring communities in the United States, China, and Japan. One of the most remarkable of these is the Koryo Saram, ethnic Koreans forcibly relocated by Stalin to the vast expanses of Central Asia. For generations, separated from the homeland by thousands of miles and the grip of the Soviet Union, they tenaciously held onto their language and customs, preserving a version of Korea frozen in the time of their grandparents. How does a culture survive such a long and enforced isolation? Their story is one of quiet determination, where making kimchi with locally grown cabbage became an act of defiance and identity. Yet the end of the Cold War and South Korea's own rapid economic ascent transformed this relationship entirely. The diaspora was no longer just a monument to a painful past. It became a vital bridge for the homeland's ambitious global future. Second and third generation Koreans abroad, perfectly bilingual and bicultural, became the ideal agents for South Korea's soft power offensive. They are the tech entrepreneurs in Silicon Valley facilitating crucial knowledge transfer, the marketing executives who understand how to position a Korean brand in a foreign market, and indeed, the idols and producers who inject a global sensibility into K-pop, making it resonate from Seoul to Sao Paulo. This is a profound shift from a diaspora defined by the trauma of war and division to one that actively projects its homeland's cultural and economic influence onto the world stage. The Korean model asks a compelling question about the modern era. Can a nation's most powerful global asset be the children it once lost to history? The stone guardians of Nineveh have watched empires rise and fall for millennia, yet the descendants of their creators now speak their ancient language in suburbs of Chicago and Sydney. The Assyrian people, indigenous to the lands of modern Iraq, Syria, and Turkey, are the living heirs to the Acadian and Assyrian empires, a continuous thread of civilization stretching back over 4,000 years. This profound lineage was violently severed in the early 20th century during the collapse of the Ottoman Empire, when they were targeted for genocide alongside their Armenian and Greek neighbors. Known as the Sefo or the Sword, this systematic campaign of massacre and displacement shattered their ancient communities, forcing a desperate exodus that created diaspora hubs across the United States, Europe, and Australia. In these new lands, the most pressing battle became one of memory. The Syriac language, a direct descendant of the Aramaic spoken by Jesus Christ, is no longer learned on the banks of the Tigris, but in Sunday school classrooms in Skokie, Illinois. The ancient liturgies of the Assyrian Church of the East, once echoing through stone chapels in the Mesopotamian plains, are now sung in rented church halls in Gothenburg, Sweden. This is a race against time and assimilation, where every hymn preserved and every word of Syriac taught to a child is a victory against erasure. How does a community of a few 100,000 maintain its unique identity amidst the overwhelming tides of global culture? The Assyrian answer lies in a fierce, almost sacred, dedication to cultural infrastructure. They have built a vibrant ecosystem of satellite television channels, online radio stations, and cultural associations that weave a digital nation across continents, ensuring that a family in Detroit can watch the same news broadcast as a cousin in Berlin. Yet this external preservation is shadowed by an ongoing political struggle for those who remain in the homeland. In Iraq and Syria, ancient Assyrian towns and villages have been emptied by recent conflicts, their populations further diminished, turning a people who were once the region's bedrock into an endangered minority in their own land. The diaspora tirelessly advocates for international recognition of these crimes and for protected rights in a homeland that is now perilously fragmented. The Assyrian story poses a haunting question for our globalized era. What is lost when the world's oldest cultures, the very sources of our shared human history, are scattered to the winds? Their fight is not just for their own survival, but for a chapter of our collective story that must not be allowed to fade from the stone. The sound of a train door slamming shut echoed across a Crimean spring night in 1944, sealing the fate of an entire nation. In a single, brutal operation, Stalin's secret police, the NKVD, rounded up every Crimean Tatar man, woman, and child they could find. The accusation was collective treason, a fabricated charge of collaboration with the Nazis used to justify the eradication of an indigenous people from their ancestral homeland. Packed into sealed cattle cars with no food or water, they were shipped on a weeks-long nightmare journey to the deserts of Uzbekistan. This was not a relocation, but a death march. The conditions were so horrific that nearly half of the entire population, estimates range up to 200,000 souls, perished from starvation and disease before they even reached the barren exile that was now their home. For the survivors, life in Central Asia was a struggle for existence under special settlement restrictions, a form of internal exile that branded them as enemies of the state for generations. They were forbidden from speaking their language in schools, their history was erased from official records, and any mention of their culture was systematically purged. How does a people maintain their identity when a superpower is determined to erase them from history itself? The answer was woven into the fabric of their daily lives. In secret, mothers taught their children the old Tata poems and songs. Families preserved the intricate patterns of their traditional embroidery, each stitch a silent act of defiance. A determined national movement began to coalesce in the 1960s, led by courageous activists who risked imprisonment to demand the right of return. They gathered petitions, documented their history, and kept the flame of their connection to Crimea burning against all odds. With the sudden collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991, that flame exploded into a homeward torrent. Hundreds of thousands of Crimean Tatars, the children and grandchildren of those first exiles, began the long, difficult journey back. They returned to a homeland that was now foreign, finding their ancestral villages occupied and their land claimed by others. With little support, they built makeshift settlements, slowly and painstakingly reconstructing their community from the ground up. For 2 decades, they worked to reclaim their place in Crimean society, reviving their language and re-establishing their cultural institutions. This hard-won return was thrown into peril once again in 2014, when Russia annexed the peninsula. Overnight, the Crimean Tatars found themselves under a new, repressive authority, with their leaders targeted, their media silenced, and their assembly banned. Their saga is a stark 20th century lesson in how the desire for a homeland can survive even the most systematic state-sponsored erasure. It forces us to ask, what does it mean to finally come home, only to find yourself once again living under the shadow of the very power that exiled you? This story of unyielding hope in the face of cyclical displacement finds a powerful echo in the experience of another group, whose exile was not across a continent, but across an entire ocean, and whose return was not to a land, but to a dream of sovereignty. 26 stories of exile, from the Babylonian captivity to the return to Crimea, whisper a single, powerful truth about humanity. While each diaspora carries its own unique sorrow and strength, certain profound patterns emerge again and again, binding these scattered peoples across the vast expanse of time. The most immediate and universal theme is the deep trauma of rupture. Whether it was the violent expulsion of the Acadians, the starvation that pushed the Irish onto coffin ships, or the genocidal campaigns that shattered the Armenians and Assyrians, this moment of catastrophic loss becomes the foundational memory for the entire diaspora. It is a psychic wound that is carefully tended and passed down through generations, a story of what was lost that forever defines who they are. From that shared trauma, however, springs an almost unbelievable resilience and adaptability. Communities in exile become masters of cultural preservation, developing ingenious strategies to protect their core identity far from the soil that once nurtured it. For the Jewish people, it was the Torah and the Talmud, a portable homeland of law and learning. For the Parsis, it was a sacred flame and a promise to enrich their new home without overflowing it. For the Vietnamese boat people, it was the aroma of pho simmering in a new country, a sensory anchor in a bewildering world. Language, religion, music, and food become not just traditions, but fortresses against the tide of assimilation, ensuring that a child in Los Angeles can recite a poem in Armenian or a grandmother in Toronto can teach her granddaughter to make kimchi just as her own grandmother did in Seoul. This resilience is almost always amplified by the creation of powerful transnational networks. The diaspora is never truly isolated. The Chinese built a bamboo network of familial trust that spans the globe, facilitating trade and investment. The Lebanese relied on intricate clan connections to build mercantile empires from West Africa to the Americas. The Cuban exiles in Miami created a political and economic force that could sway American foreign policy for decades. These networks function as a nervous system for the global community, allowing for the flow of money, information, and mutual support, transforming individual exile into a collective power. And in nearly every case, this scattering leads to a beautiful and complex process of cultural fusion. The exiled community does not simply replicate its old life in a new land. It adapts, it borrows, and it blends. The Cajuns of Louisiana created their vibrant culture by mixing Acadian French with Spanish, German, and Choctaw influences. The music of the African diaspora gave birth to the blues, to jazz, to samba, by weaving together African rhythms with European and indigenous forms. The Romani violin carries traces of every land its people have traveled through. This fusion enriches not only the diaspora itself but the entire host society, adding new flavors to its food, new rhythms to its music, and new perspectives to its intellectual life. So what do these recurring threads of trauma, resilience, network building, and fusion tell us? They reveal that the experience of diaspora, for all its pain, is a fundamental and repeating engine of human history. It is a process that forges incredible strength from profound loss, that builds global bridges from broken local ties, and that constantly remixes the ingredients of human culture to create new and vibrant forms of life. These 26 stories are not just isolated chapters of tragedy. They are a collective lesson in the unyielding human capacity to rebuild a world from fragments, to find home in community when it is lost in geography, and to forever carry the past into the future, no matter how far the journey. Our journey through these 27 civilizations in exile reveals a history not just of kingdoms and battles, but of people, their movements, their struggles, and their indelible impact on the world. These are not footnotes to history, they are its very lifeblood, a force that has repeatedly shattered old orders and sown the seeds for new ones. The most powerful legacy of diaspora is its role as an engine of cultural change. Think of the Phoenician alphabet, a practical merchant's tool that was adapted by the Greeks and became the bedrock of Western literacy. Or the classical Greek texts carried to Italy by Byzantine scholars fleeing a falling empire, which then ignited the intellectual fires of the Renaissance. In every case, the scattering of a people forced a meeting of minds and traditions, a creative friction that produced new art, new music, and new ways of seeing the world. This cultural dynamism is matched by a profound capacity for economic innovation. The Chinese bamboo network and the Lebanese clan-based trust systems are not just business models, they are brilliant adaptations of ancient social structures to a globalized world, creating flows of capital and goods that bypass traditional channels and build wealth across continents. And we cannot overlook the political transformations born from exile. The Jewish diaspora's 2,000-year hope for Zion culminated in the modern state of Israel, a dramatic reclamation of sovereignty. The relentless advocacy of the Armenian diaspora secured global recognition for their history, while the political might of Cuban exiles in Miami shaped American foreign policy for generations. These stories prove that a people, even when physically separated from their homeland, can wield immense influence and forever alter the political landscape. The legacies of these scattered civilizations remind us that identity is not anchored solely to soil, but can be carried in a song, a recipe, or a sacred text. Culture is not a static monument, but a living, breathing entity that adapts, borrows, and grows stronger through fusion, much like the Cajun gumbo that blends many ingredients into a uniquely flavorful whole. The true map of human connection is not drawn in simple lines of border and nation. It is a complex, shimmering web of memory, kinship, and shared experience that stretches across oceans and centuries. Let this exploration be a starting point for your own curiosity. The stories of diaspora are all around us, in the vibrant music from a local festival, the family-run restaurant on a familiar street corner, and the diverse faces that make up our shared humanity. If these histories of resilience and renewal resonated with you, consider subscribing for more deep dives into the mysteries of our past. We would love to hear which diaspora's story you found most compelling, so share your thoughts in the comments